Professor Chomsky,
Yep.
at the end of your speech, you mentioned that we have no will. We have the ability, but not the will to tear down the walls and the constraints around us. Why haven't we done that already? And what specifically could we do to start making that happen?
Well, if you take a look at history, there are long periods where people are suffering but don't do very much. Occasionally they arise and do things. Take the 1950s. Happened to be a very quiescent period, not much activism. 1961, a couple of students, black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided to sit in a lunch counter, which was illegal. They were very quickly arrested, brutally expelled. That could have been the end of it, except that the next day, some more black students came and sat at the lunch counter. They were arrested and thrown out. Pretty soon, this grew. You had the formation of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which led the civil rights movement. You pretty soon had freedom riders going through the South in buses, exposing themselves to brutality, killing, all kind of horrors, but trying to register poor black people. You had Northern volunteers coming down, and pretty soon you had mass demonstrations. Finally, you had the March on Washington and Martin Luther King's great I Have a Dream speech. And in fact, significant legislation was enacted. Didn't end the story by any means. There's a long story that follows. But that was a significant change. Around the same time, you had the beginning, bare beginning, of small groups, mostly students, beginning to protest the Indochina War. It had been going on for a long time. But finally, by the mid-60s, you did get a visible protest movement. It became huge, became enormous, in fact. It was powerful enough so that policy had to reflect it. One of the most interesting parts of the Pentagon Papers is the part that deals with the few months of early 1968. That's where the papers end. A few months of early 1968, after the Tet Offensive in January 1968. That was a big surprise to the United States. They had no idea. It was an amazing uprising in South Vietnam. The president wanted to send more troops, but the Joint Chiefs of Staff were opposed. They said they would need the troops for civil disorder control in the United States, from women, from youth, from minorities, from others. There was enough uproar and protest in the United States, they didn't send the troops. What happened after that was pretty horrible, but it could have been a lot worse. And the same is true. In the same years, the women's movement began. The modern women's movement goes way back. It started with small consciousness-raising groups, small groups of people talking to each other. Pretty soon it became a major movement. It had enormous effects, probably more effects on the society than anything else that came out of the activism of the 60s. So, for example, it's interesting to look at the history. At the time of the American Revolution, the colonists, of course, took over British law, British common law. And according to British common law, you read it in Blackstone and so on, women were not really people. They were property. A woman was the property of her father. Property was transferred over to the husband. You look at the Constitutional Convention, one of the arguments against allowing women to vote was that it would be unfair to unmarried men, because a married man would have 2 votes, since, of course, the property votes the way its owner does. Well, that was then. And slow changes took place. It was as late as 1975, not that long ago, in the wake of the growing women's movement, that the Supreme Court finally ruled that women are people. The ruling was actually granting women the right to serve as on federal juries. If you think about the law, you're supposed to be tried by a jury of your peers, and your peers have to be people. Prior to that, women did not have that legal right. Well, that's a big change, one of many. A lot of things went along with it. So why did these things happen? Because small groups of people had the will and struggled and brought others along. And that's the way it's happened all through history. So if you ask why it's not happening now, well, not enough people have the will. You can, and for people, younger people, say people of your age, it's a very serious necessity because it's your generation and the following one or two generations which are going to suffer the dire effects of creation of a world in which decent survival may be impossible. Survival, yes, but not decent survival. That's not very far off. That's even aside from the threat of nuclear war, always imminent, and many other things, including the prison that John Berger was talking about. It's not a trivial fact that for the past generation, under the kind of neoliberal assault against the population, for most of the population of the United States, income has pretty much stagnated or declined, and benefits have declined. Schools are under attack. Infrastructures are wreck. We now have a socioeconomic system which is pretty remarkable. Just take a look at it. There are tens of millions of people who want to work and can't find employment. The employment statistics are very much understated. They don't count people who've simply given up. So that's tens of millions of idle hands. There's a huge amount of work to be done. The infrastructure's falling apart. The energy system badly needs massive work. The health system is an international scandal. Teachers are needed. It goes on and on. So huge amounts of work to be done, plenty of idle hands, ample resources. Now, the corporate sector is just overflowing with wealth. The banks are, as I said, richer than ever before. So idle hands, needed work, plenty of resources. Socioeconomic system is so pathological, can't put them together. Now, that's a problem, a serious human problem. And it's easy to go on. So yes, there are plenty of things to do. There's plenty of ways to do them, but it does require, what's that? Monstrous devices, which I forgot to turn off. I can find it. Sorry. But then comes your question. Will people have the will to do it? The opportunity's there. It's happened all through history. When people had the will, like, say, those black students in Greensboro, things began to happen.
Thank you.